No, na burris boatin. Musamme namale doamsta team yamunain Anishinaabe ekis ta eami ser stor savichatsi matagatis. Un perras lekita ja kuola ja arvi sami sida ser yamun haladivchan ovtas kutniahti muskojam almagid in geatnamis me deavi rodne. So hello and welcome. My name is Tim Frandy. I am from UBC's Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies, where I work as a professor of Nordic Indigenous Studies, which is basically Sami, which is my cultural background. I grew up on Anishinaabe Aki, Anishinaabe lands in the far north of northern Wisconsin, on the south shore of Lake Superior, Gitchigami, the great heart at the center of Turtle Island. My family, however, comes from the Kemi Sami communities, the Sidas of Kitka and Kuoliavri along the Finnish-Russian border. And I've introduced myself in that fashion in Sami, North Sami language, and also took a moment to pay respect in Sami language to the Musqueam people upon whose lands we're gathered today. It's my great pleasure to meet and to introduce our guest, Niiyokamigaabaw Deondre Smiles, a member of the Ga-Zagaskwa Jimikag Ojibwe, or the Leech Lake Band of Anishinaabe, currently in what's called Minnesota. An assistant professor of geography at the University of Victoria, the research interests include indigenous geographies and epistemologies, human-environmental interaction, political ecology, and tribal cultural resource preservation and protection. Deondre has published nearly 24 articles and chapters on topics including indigenous geographies, indigenous erasure, slow violence, state violence, and settler colonial violence, and quite recently about Paul Bunyan as settler colonial myth-making, which I'm excited to read. Deondre is the PI of UVic's Geographic Indigenous Futures Collaboratory, active in the leadership of the Indigenous Peoples Speciality Group of the American Association of Geographers, a member of the editorial board of the journal Native American and Indigenous Studies, my personal favorite academic journal on the planet, and they also serve on the board of trustees for Leech Lake Tribal College. Beyond this, Niiyokamigaabaw is a well-known public scholar across countless social media platforms who has tirelessly advocated for indigenous sovereignties, done the challenging work of elevating Black indigeneity in communities where anti-Blackness too often is found, and has brought the 7 grandfather teachings of humility, honesty, wisdom, love, respect, truth, and bravery to all of their work. So I'm thrilled to hear this talk, and thank you, and please join me in welcoming Niiyokamigaabaw.
All right. So, miigwech Tim for that really, really wonderful introduction. I have been a professor now for 3 years, and I don't think I have still quite adopted this sort of like self-assured persona that we're expected to have as faculty. And so it feels really cool to hear myself be introduced at the beginning of talks. I told Tim I wasn't going to start off the introduction in this way, but I'm going to do it anyways because it's kind of funny. This is the third time that I have had a kind of an interaction with the University of British Columbia. The first time is when I was admitted to the PhD program in geography here and subsequently did not go because I quickly realized that stipends don't quite go as far in Vancouver as people think that they might. The second time was when I came and job interviewed here in the geography department. It was a really, really cool visit because I came right in the middle of one of Vancouver's rare snowstorms, and so they packed my job talk, my research talk, my interview, and of course the most important part, the after interview dinner, all into one day. Also got to go down and see Wreck Beach in all of its icy glory. So I'm just really happy to be back here. I always forget, too, that usually we start off these things with introductions, so I included a few introduction slides for myself, so you'll get to hear me kind of repeat some of the information. But my name is Niiyokamigaabaw Deondre Smiles. I am really happy to be presenting my talk today called Settler Grave Disturbances Ecocide. Now that is one hell of a title, kind of a number of really fancy words in there, and we'll tell you about what all of those mean. But first, I'm going to do something that I don't usually do and tell you a little bit about myself, because I view it as always vitally important for you to get to know me as a person, not just the guy that they brought in from Victoria to come and talk to you about burial disturbances. So a little bit about me. So, I've been an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria across the Straits of Georgia since July of 2021. Just fingers crossed, just got through the reappointment process, and so now I just have tenure to look forward to. Even though I have noticed a few Canadianisms start to creep into my vocabulary, and I start to notice the accent starting to creep into my voice, starting to elongate vowels and things of that nature, I am not Canadian. I am originally from the United States. I come from a city that we call in my people's language Gakabikong. You might better know it as Minneapolis. I spent the first 26 years of my life in Minnesota. And then at some point decided I better get out of here, and I went off and left Minnesota. Before I did that, I did a bachelor's degree in geography from St. Cloud State University, did a master's degree in global indigenous studies at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and then did a PhD in geography at the program that I chose over UBC, which was a program at the Ohio State University in Columbus, where I also spent a year as a postdoc in indigenous environmental history. So I'm one of those folks that I'm very interdisciplinary in scope, right? I like talking to folks in different disciplines, and so sometimes I feel like I don't make a very, very good geographer, but that's all right. But speaking of being a geographer, there is something that I'll let you in on, kind of a little secret here. When you get your PhD in geography, they make you promise that you have to include at least one map in every single slide deck that you put together as a faculty member. Otherwise, they will come and rip up your diploma from you. Obviously, I'm joking, but my undergraduates, believe me, sometimes they're like, do they really do that? And then I play along with it for a little bit, then I'm like, no, of course not. But here's my obligatory map anyways. That's my nation's territory. I'm Gazagasqua Jimikag, or the Leech Lake Reservation, a tribal sovereign nation located in north central Minnesota. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the geographies of Minnesota, maybe not many of you. So here's the twin cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, where I'm circling my cursor. Here's our reserve right up here. Like I said, I grew up in the city. I'm what they would call an urban native, but I still try to go home whenever I can. I serve on the board of trustees of my tribe's college, and I have long-standing research relationships with my nation, some of which I will talk to you about today. So what do? Up until fairly recently, I used to stir a lot of SHIT on Twitter. I won't call it X, it's Twitter. But then I decided that my own mental health and was probably well served by taking a step back from that platform, and I think my wife is a little bit happier too. As a matter of fact, that's a picture of myself and my wife right there back when we first moved to Victoria. My wife is also a doctor. I'm a doctor of audiology. They just started a job at a hearing clinic in Victoria on Monday, so we're pretty happy about that, which is awesome. But anyways, back to me. What sorts of things do I do besides rabble-rouse and social media? Well, I find myself really hard to put into boxes, right? Grew up with a very curious mind, grew up wanting to learn different sorts of things. I've still kind of embraced that kind of identity. But on grant applications and on promotional materials, you have to say that you specialize in certain things. You can't say, well, I do everything, right? Because that's not how you get grants. A grant reviewer will see that and be like, well, you do everything? That's not possible. So I've managed to put myself into kind of 5 categories. I'm a critical indigenous geographer, so I focus on the ways that power and hegemony play into relationships with space and place. I focus on human-environment interactions and political ecology, or the way that politics and power and structures of power impact the way that indigenous peoples interact with the environments. I focus on indigenous cultural resource preservation, will actually be kind of the main focus of the talk today. Essentially, I've done a lot of long-standing work surrounding burial sites and burial protections. And I also do a lot of science and technology studies work. And so the ways that indigenous science can be just as worthy of inclusion in the academy as what we would call dominant science. So besides that, I am the principal investigator of the Geographic Indigenous Futures Lab at the University of Victoria. We are a Indigenous-focused research lab that focuses on building Indigenous resurgence in communities related to space and place and climate. So we have a number of cool collaborations already, ranging from Minnesota all the way out to the east to Clayoquot Sound on Vancouver Island, where we're building some relationships with First Nations there. And so it's one of my favorite parts of my job. I get to supervise 6 amazing graduate students and then another 5 to 7 lab members, depending on kind of the year, who are geographically spread out from Aotearoa in the Pacific all the way to Montreal, all the way out east. So that's the kind of work I do. Yeah, so there you go. That's I usually don't like talking about myself, but we'll start out by doing that. But let's get to the main point of the talk. And by doing so, I want to start out by defining, well, what is the term ecocide, right? Because that's part of my talk. That's part of the title. How do we define ecocide? Well, ecocide, according to the Stop Ecocide Foundation, defines it, and they actually just looked on their website, and they actually came up with this whole process of trying to really substantially, fulsomely define this. They define it as the unlawful or wanton acts committed with knowledge that there is a substantial likelihood of severe and either widespread or long-term damage to the environment being caused by those acts. Let me put it in a little bit more of a pithy manner. Basically, it means knowledgeable, willful damage and destruction and degradation of the environment. Well, I'm going to introduce another term to you that you may or may not be familiar with that I think ties into ecocide in a pretty messed up way. And that concept is settler colonialism. What is settler colonialism? Well, settler colonialism is a concept that came about in about the 1980s, probably more accurately the 1990s. Where people wanted to try to define colonization that was different from what we understood as traditional colonization, or what we now understand to be franchise colonialism. So by franchise colonialism, I'm talking about kind of the style of colonialism that you found in Africa, where European powers would go in, basically extract raw resources. They weren't really too concerned with governing the territories. They oftentimes let local leaders still do the governing, but they were really focused about extracting economic benefits out of the territories, out of the colonies. Well, a number of scholars thought, well, what about colonization that occurred in Canada? What about colonization that occurred in the United States? What about in Australia? What about New Zealand? What about in places such as like Palestine or South Africa? That's colonization too, but it functions a little bit differently, right? How do we theorize this? Well, a number of scholars, including the late scholar Patrick Wolf, came up with a definition of settler colonialism where they said, well, settler colonialism is colonization that is built upon the settlement and enduring occupation of land by a colonizing power at the expense of indigenous presence upon the land. And so there's a couple of givens there where they say, well, these are places where there were already existing populations, but people from outside of these geographies came in and basically displaced the indigenous population off of the land so that they could inhabit it themselves. So Patrick Wolf came up with, well, he was paraphrasing another scholar, but he wrote a statement that is kind of one of the foundational tenets of settler colonialism, in which he says, settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. Well, what does he mean by this? What do we mean when we talk about structure versus event? Well, of course, there is a point where colonization begins, right? But there is not a point, according to Wolf and other scholars, where colonists, settlers will say, oh, well, we've done all we can do with the land. We're going to pack up and we're going to go back to Europe, or we're going to go back to insert other place here. The idea is that settler colonialism wants to put down roots, that it wants to build structures, it wants to gain control of land, and there isn't an end date to it. The idea is that it wants to be a permanent fixture. There is kind of an undefined, basically, it wants to maintain itself into an undefined future. It does this through various ways, right? But the idea basically that I've begun to theorize and that a number of other indigenous scholars have talked about is that eventually settler colonialism wants to get to the point where settlers themselves can become indigenous, where they can start to say, well, I'm from this land, right? I'm indigenous to the land. And you hear this nowadays in the United States and Canada. You'll see people say, well, I'm not a settler. My family has lived here for 200 years, right? We've put down roots here. We've farmed the land. We have built, we've helped build this country. You know, we're not settlers. And that is the point of settler colonialism. That essentially it wants to make indigeneity become so mundane, so widespread, so easily adopted by everybody that it loses its own kind of special identity. Well, what we understand to be what I would call a Wolffian model of settler colonialism, or kind of just focusing on just occupation of land, was kind of the dominant way of thinking about settler colonialism until fairly recently, when Patrick Wolf passed away about 7 or 8 years ago. But a number of scholars that have kind of grown up and cut their academic teeth with this kind of theoretical framework began to think, and they said, well, yes, settler colonialism functions through the occupation of land, but what is it that people are doing with the land, right? They're not just wanting to become squatters on the land, right? They want to do something with it. A scholar by the name of Cy Englert, who focuses on settler colonialism in particular in the Palestinian context, wrote an article a few years ago where he said, well, settler colonialism, there's much more to it than just a focus on land, right? Settler colonialism isn't just focused on controlling land, but it's focused on the exploitation of land. Essentially, Englert used a Marxist analysis of settler colonialism to say, you know, in the settler state, the people that can exploit the land the most are the ones that hold the most power. Now, I don't know. If we take a look at our political systems, maybe in the United States more so than Canada, right? Who are the people that hold the levers of power? Who are the people that hold economic power? Those are people that can exploit the land, exploit resources, exploit workers the most, right? And so that's kind of where I've turned to in my reckoning of settler colonialism and how I theorize it. No matter which approach you take, settler colonialism ultimately, it eliminates to replace, right? That it wants to sweep away indigenous presence and build settler presence on top of it. And it relies on a myth of terra nullius to proceed. Might have just uttered another brand new term for you. These are cool things. I guarantee you that, well, actually, I'm not that mean that I was going to joke around and lie to you and say you could utter them at parties and people will think you're really cool. If you say terra nullius at a party, that is a really cool way, or a really good way to demonstrate probably maybe how academically nerdy you might be. But I don't know. Don't listen to me about parties. I haven't been to a party since like the second year of my undergrad, which was too long ago now. So terra nullius. Terra nullius is a Latin term that means nobody's land, no man's land. This is part of the settler colonial mythology. This is at the heart of what makes settler colonialism define itself, right? So these kind of stories where you hear about, well, we built a country out of nothing. We built a country out of the wilderness. The land was empty. Well, actually, you know, there were indigenous peoples here that we brutally genocided to build this country. Well, that's okay, because if you take a look at how they were using the land, they were so bad at using this land productively that it might as well be empty and unused. I think about the words of UBC's own Cole Harris when he talked about British settler colonialism here in what we now call BC. And he particularly salient example to me was a quotation from a British military officer to First Nations on Vancouver Island, where that military officer, when talking to First Nations to try to gain land from them, told them, well, before we came along, you didn't know how to use this land, right? We came here, we taught you how to mine coal, we taught you how to grow crops, we taught you how to become productive members of our Anglo-settler society, right? We basically taught you how to be proper, civilized human beings. And if you think about it in those terms, don't you owe it to us to allow us to have control over this land? Of course, it's a little more complex than that, but or at least the kind of the processes of treaty, right? Particularly here in BC, but that was kind of the general understanding that, oh, well, these indigenous peoples don't know how to use the land, so we need to put them on reserves. We need to take the land away from them, and we need to, on one hand, they'll say, well, we're going to show you how to use a land, but of course, that use of the land was to enrich settlers themselves. So terra nullius is actually a legal term, right? There is a number of court cases in Australia in the 1990s surrounding Aboriginal land title that questioned the legitimacy of terra nullius, where the British came in and said, well, there's no political entity controlling this vast continent that we can deal with, and so we're going to claim it in the name of the Crown. A number of court cases kind of pushed back and said, well, no, there are a number of different Aboriginal indigenous polities here on the land. So therefore, your argument is not quite as valid as you make it out to be. Of course, that didn't really shake the legitimacy of the British settler state in a legal framework, but it was a legal term that was being used. There are similar concepts, of course, that inspired American and Canadian settler colonialism. The picture on the right-hand side of this slide here is the infamous painting Manifest Destiny that describes kind of this, what was viewed as a God-given right for the United States of America to spread from sea to shining sea, from the eastern seaboard all the way to the Pacific, and all of the brutal genocidal land dispossession and violence that against indigenous peoples that entailed. So, settler colonialism is not a very, very good thing, in my humble opinion. If somebody tells you that it is a good thing, they are likely lying to you, and you can tell them that from me. But among its various unsavory effects, of which we could spend an entire term worth of seminars talking about, I want to focus briefly on impacts to the environment. And so settler colonialism wrought widespread changes to landscapes, such as the creation of farms upon indigenous lands, or more accurately, the appropriation of indigenous farms to be turned into settler farms. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz actually talks about in her book, An Indigenous History of the United States, how settlers came across indigenous farms and said, oh, this doesn't quite track with how we viewed indigenous agriculture, that they're actually growing these vastly productive farms that are almost more productive than our European-style agriculture. Instead of trying to learn from the indigenous peoples, usually they simply just appropriated the land away from them. The extraction of natural resources, which we will get a little bit deeper into here in this talk, and the overhunting of animals, among other things, right? My friends on the prairies oftentimes talk about the impact still of the overhunting of bison on the prairies or on the American Great Plains, and how that was designed to bring plains indigenous nations into a more sedentary lifestyle. We still see impacts on the environment today, right? Through extractive industries such as mining, pipeline development, etc. This is maybe a little bit of an editorial aside, right? BC and Minnesota have a lot in common, and you might think, what? Like those are, there's 2,000 miles between them, but they are both, in my mind, resource extraction corporations masquerading as political subdivisions, right? If you take a look at an economic kind of I'm forgetting the word here, I'm not an economist, but kind of a breakdown of the different economies in BC, the extractive industries, mining, forestry, makes up a vast amount of the economic output of this province, just like mining and forestry makes up a huge proportion of the economic output of my home state. No matter the environmentally destructive use of the land, indigenous lands seem to always be kind of placed at ground zero for this, right? They are flooded, they are host to resource extraction related industries, like the picture I have here is an abandoned uranium mine on the Navajo Nation in the southwestern United States, where the United States, after the Second World War, came to the Navajo and said, hey, we need to mine uranium so that we can build nuclear bombs so that we can bomb the Eastern Bloc out of existence if we need to in a war, right? Obviously, it wouldn't do for us to be getting uranium from other places that could potentially be friendly to the Soviet Union, and so we want to build up our own sources of uranium here. And your reservation happens to be host to some of the biggest uranium deposits in the country, or in the world. You also live in poverty. You're struggling to find jobs. Notwithstanding the fact that we caused you to be in this economic situation. Why don't you let us build these mines on your reservation? We'll allow your citizens to go and work in the mines, and you'll make money, and you'll help do your patriotic duty to our country. And so the example given here is that the Navajo Nation was home to these vast uranium mines where Navajo workers would go in without protection. And there's a reason, right, why if you go to like the dentist or you go get x-rays, they make you wear a shield, because radiation is not good for you, right? Now imagine being surrounded by radioactive dust and mining radioactive material day in and day out for decades. A lot of sick people, and of course, when the uranium mines gave out, the United States Department of Energy said, okay, well, thanks for allowing us to mine this. We're going to take off now. Yeah, you can worry about remediating these abandoned mines. And so there's widespread water contamination, and there's these open pit mines that continue to dot the landscape. All right. So at this point, you're probably like, hey, wait a second, Deondre. You said that this talk was going to be about grave disturbances. Why are you talking about uranium mining, and why are you talking about environmental destruction? Well, I promise you that we're going to tie all of this together. But before we do that, I'm going to switch gears completely now, and I'm going to talk about another form of degradation. And that is degradation of indigenous remains. Again, I'll engage in a little bit of editorialism here. Time and time again, I read about these collections of remains being found in museums and being found at universities and being found in people's private collections of things that they took out of indigenous burial sites, such as burial mounds, cemeteries. And I have come to the conclusion that there is a very odd settler obsession with indigenous remains. It just excites people, and people get into it like nothing I have ever seen before. There has been a long history in the United States and in Canada of settler grave robbing of indigenous graves to obtain remains. Now, grave robbing did not start with settler colonialism. Of course, grave robbing has been happening for as long as there have been human graves, but there seems to be a particular frequency and fervor for the ways that indigenous burial sites have historically and contemporaneously been disturbed and ransacked for various purposes. One of those uses quite often was, well, souvenirs, right? In my dissertation research, I read the personal letters and records of the state archaeologist in Minnesota, and she would talk about people who, for like some weird pastime, would go around known indigenous burial sites with metal detectors trying to find cool artifacts, right? And when she caught them and said, hey, what are you doing? Instead of being like, oh, well, I shouldn't do this, you'd be like, what's the big deal? People have been doing this all the time, right? Why are you coming after me for doing this? Cadavers for medical experimentation. One of the stories from back home that is a really strong example of this is that the largest mass execution in American history was at Mankato, Minnesota on December 26, 1862, when 38 Dakota men were hanged on charges of insurrection. This was at the conclusion of an armed uprising against the American government and the Minnesota state government. They hanged the 38 men, buried them in a riverbank, and no sooner than they had buried them, doctors and all kinds of scientists descended upon Mankato and literally dug up the remains and started to make off with cadavers. And I think they did so for a number of hours and took maybe like almost a dozen cadavers before the military finally had to put a guard there at the burial site to stop them from doing so. People would take skulls and bones out of burial sites for pseudoscientific measurements of indigenous intelligence and capacity for civilization, right? Particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, this was the time when people were trying to embrace science in ways that were not so savory, not so ethical, right? They would take remains and try to say, well, I've come up with this technique to be able to determine how civilized or how intelligent somebody is, right? And all you need to do is you measure their skull. This actually tied into settler land grabs and environmental destruction. And so when they would steal skulls out of indigenous burial mounds and burial sites, for example, they would then take the skulls and measure them in order to determine their skull capacity. There was a science, or I call it a pseudoscience, called phrenology, right? Or the idea that you could determine somebody's intelligence based on the volume of their skull or their brain cavity in their skull. It's really, really ghastly stuff. They would literally take the skull, pour seeds into it, and they would use a measurement, and they say, okay, so it can hold this many seeds, so therefore they have this size of brain cavity, and they have this corresponding amount of intelligence. Now, for those of you that know your 19th and 20th century pseudoscience, you know that generally speaking, anybody who was not white was generally viewed to have lesser intelligence, right? This was all the rage, where they would literally try to measure people's nose, measure the circumference of their skull, measure their chins, take all kinds of measurements. And they would do, in the information that they would glean from this, they would then publish in books such as Samuel Morton's Crania Americana, and then people would take that and use that for anthropological measurements of the living. So in the late 19th century in the United States, this is what we would call the allotment era. After 1887, there was an act that was passed, the General Allotment Act, where Native American reservations would be divided up into individual parcels of land. This was kind of a technique to try to, again, get rid of the collective nature of indigenous land ownership and instead try to promote individual land ownership and try to get indigenous peoples to farm the land or make productive use of the land on their own as a way to make them assimilate into the broader settler colonial state. Now, how do you try to determine who is entitled to an allotment? Well, you use a couple of different pseudoscientific measurements, such as, trying to, one of the things was blood quantum, right? Or trying to determine how much, quote, Indian blood somebody had based on their descendants, right? Their mother and father and relatives before them. But one of the other things was the measurement of living people. And so there was an article that was written by a White Earth band of Ojibwe tribal member named David Bolio back in the 1980s that talked about on the White Earth Reservation, which is located in northwestern Minnesota, not too far away from my tribe's reservation back in the late 1800s, where a group of anthropologists came onto the reservation and measured the length of people's hair, measured if they had hair on their chest, measured their body types, and used those kinds of measurements to try to determine if they were native enough to qualify for land ownership, right? And a lot of the data that they used in order to kind of establish those standards came through grave robbing and the usage of indigenous dead in order to come up with these bodily measurements. Now, people that were, quote, Indian enough got allotments of land, right? People that were not Indian enough did not qualify for allotments of land. The allotments that were supposed to be guaranteed to people that didn't quite meet native criteria was taken immediately by settlers for their own uses. Land that was allotted to native people was also swindled out of their hands through various legal and extra-legal mechanisms, and was subsequently taken over by settlers for economic benefit. Okay. So I'm starting to slowly weave this all together here. What were some of the economic benefits that settlers derived from indigenous lands? Well, let's take a look at a few more obligatory maps here. So this map is the area of old-growth forest in the United States in 1850. The original map said virgin forest. That is not how we refer to old-growth forest, because that essentially insinuates that indigenous peoples didn't tend to forest before colonization. We did. If you take a look at the United States, each little black dot represents 25,000 acres of land. Now, there's a whole lot of old-growth forest in the United States in 1850, right? Particularly up in what we would call the Pacific Northwest or the West Coast, there are some areas that have been untouched. Now, between 1850 and, say, 1926, you see allotment, you see the widespread movement of indigenous peoples onto reservations, and you see people move in and start to exploit the land, and then you end up with something like this, where you see virtually almost all of the strands of old-growth forest have been cut down 76 years after this map was created. Now, there is environmental destruction that can come through this besides just cutting down trees. Let me give you a few examples of this, right? So in the 19th century, forestry techniques were not as, quote, sustainable as they are now. So nowadays, when forestry companies cut down trees, cut down forests, they try to follow a practice where they say, well, we're going to replant trees, right? We're going to try to replant trees and come up with remediation strategies for the land. In, say, 1894, that was not the case. You cut down trees, you took the logs, and you left the waste material kind of on the forest floor because that wasn't useful to you, right? Well, for those of you that how many of you folks like a good beach fire? None of you? A couple of you. So Gunilla. Now, there are certain times of year when they probably tell you you are not supposed to be having a beach fire, right? Why might that be? You could possibly cause a forest fire. I really like in Victoria, the people are actually that quite vigilant about it, where students will constantly be like, oh, where's a really, really good place to have a beach fire near you, Vic? And everybody's like, the moment you light one, they'll call the fire department on you. Like, people are like literally waiting for this because it could cause forest fires with disastrous effect. How do we know this? Well, here, feels like almost every year now, every summer, we kind of get an idea of this. Back home in Minnesota, we have a historic story to tell us about why it is that we don't leave combustible material in forests. On a summer day in 1894 near a small town named Hinckley, it was a very hot, dry summer, and a spark there's a couple of different stories. One story says that this fire was sparked by a lightning strike. Other people say that, it came from a spark that came off of a railroad track from a train passing through. Regardless of what happened, a bunch of waste material caught fire in a central Minnesota forest, and one of the largest forest fires in American history raged, right? This is... The stories, the eyewitness stories say that they saw fireballs up to 5 miles high above the ground that was created by the combustible material. Like, imagine like the mushroom cloud from an atom bomb. This was comparable to this. There were stories that trains that were trying to outrun the fire literally got to stations thinking that they had gotten away from the fire, only to find that their cabooses were on fire because the fire was moving that quickly. Thousands of people passed away. To me, this is a direct consequence of settler land theft and dispossession from indigenous peoples and environmentally unsafe practices, right? This didn't just happen in the 19th century. Let's fast forward to the 1970s, which was not that long ago, right? This was a mining tailings plant along the shore of Lake Superior. Northern Minnesota is home to a strong mining industry, and in the 1950s and 1960s, new mining techniques were developed to try to revitalize the industry. And the idea was that, we'll refine this low-grade iron ore, and then we'll put it on trains, and we'll transport it to Lake Superior, where we'll put it on ships and sail it down to the lower Great Lakes, where it can then be created into steel in steel mills. Well, this process of creating what we call taconite, or kind of low-grade iron ore, kind of generates kind of leftover waste material. Now, this waste material is hazardous and toxic, and so, of course, in peak 1970s fashion, they decided, where's the best place to put this, right? Let's put it right next to the lake. And so this huge pile here of taconite tailings grew and grew and grew for 20 years, and people thought nothing of it until the early 1970s, when the city of Duluth, just down at the tip of Lake Superior, started to find asbestos in its drinking water. And there was a lawsuit, and the company had to relocate those tailings inland, right? Another example of not so savory environmental practices based out of indigenous land. That's because the land that the mines were built on were taken away from indigenous peoples through land cession treaties. And this lake here was a source of food and cultural activities for indigenous peoples from multiple tribal nations in both Minnesota and Wisconsin and Michigan, as well as First Nations in Ontario, Canada. Another more modern example that is still in existence today. Now, this is a power plant. Doesn't look too remarkable, except it's a nuclear power plant, the Prairie Island Nuclear Power Plant, which provides nuclear power to the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. This big body of water behind it is the Mississippi River, which is the largest river and host of the biggest river system in the United States and in North America, more generally, right? Now, there's a couple of things about the placement of this nuclear power plant. One of them is that, of course, it's next to a river, and they think, the water will help cool down the reactor, right? If it melts down, then the water can flood in and shut down the reactor and help cool it down. And in the meantime, it will keep it from overheating and from leading to any kind of broader fluctuations. I'm not a nuclear physicist either. I got to find better terminology for this. So that's one kind of thing about that placement. Now the Mississippi River, being from there, it floods quite often, right? It floods every spring. We take a look at that. We keep an eye on the flood levels. Prairie Island, the nuclear power plant, is located in what we call a 500-year floodplain of the Mississippi River. What does this mean? That means that at least once every 500 years, the Mississippi River could flood to a level where it could possibly inundate the nuclear power plant. We don't know when that flood could happen. It could happen 475 years from now. It could happen later this spring, right? We don't know. So you might say, well, that's fine, right? Nuclear power plants are safe. They have shutdown mechanisms to ensure that nothing bad will happen. Well, I'm not so much worried about that as I'm worried about these things right here, which are casks of nuclear waste. Now, in the United States, since the 1980s, we have been kind of having this debate over whether we should put our nuclear waste in this mountain called Yucca Mountain, right? And a number of people have said, well, that's a really bad idea to put nuclear waste inside of a mountain. And so it hasn't quite opened yet, but we keep still holding out hope, right? Thinking like, oh yes, maybe Yucca Mountain will open one day and we can put our nuclear waste there and we can lock it away in that mountain and we don't need to worry about it. In the meantime, plants have to put their nuclear waste somewhere. And so Prairie Island has put it on this concrete apron right here in these metal casks. Well, again, nobody really knows how widespread a 500-year flood from the Mississippi River might be. It could very well be that that water could rise all the way up, get all the way to this concrete apron, pick up those casks and carry them into the river. The company that runs the plant says they think that those casks could stand up to being submerged and being banged around in a river. Nobody really knows for sure, right? A nuclear accident of various kinds, whether it's through a meltdown or through an accidental release of nuclear waste, could poison the water source for up to 50 million Americans in the span of a few minutes. For me, there's one other really problematic thing about this, and you can't see it here because it's just out of range of this photograph. The Prairie Island Dakota community is right next to the nuclear power plant. They were not consulted about the placement of that nuclear power plant. That nuclear power plant is, about 300 meters away from their child care center. The company that runs the power plant says, well, the power plant is fine. We've only had one corrective action against us by the United States EPA over the last 50 years. Now, and the faculty here might kind of agree with me and might chuckle, right? A student getting one question wrong on a midterm or things like that, that's fine. Things happen. Like a student failing one assignment, okay, maybe not preferable, but it's okay. Failing a safety inspection as a nuclear power plant is not a good thing, especially when you are located right next to a community, right? And so when they say, oh, it's no big deal, we've only failed once like 10 years ago, Prairie Island is like, why are you being so casual about that, right? One more example here that is really close to me personally. The largest inland oil spill in American history. So when I ask my students about the largest oil spills in North American history, they say, oh, well, Deepwater Horizon, Exxon Valdez. And I'm like, well, it's the largest inland oil spill. And they're like, oh, I don't know that. In early 1991, Enbridge's Line 3 sprung a leak over a frozen tributary of the Mississippi River, located about, I'd say, let me do the calculations here. I'm still learning the metric system. I'd say about 15 kilometers outside of the external boundaries of my tribe's reservation. Spilled millions of gallons of oil onto this river, and we were really fortunate that that river was frozen and that people could come and clean it up. Otherwise, it would have poisoned the drinking water source of several million Minnesotans and potentially tens of millions of Americans within the span of a few days. And so Enbridge, a good old Canadian company, when they came to my nation and they said, we want to rebuild Line 3. Can we build it through your territory again? We actually had a referendum on my nation, and for those of you that know Indigenous politics, it can be tough to get people to agree on anything, right? It's particularly my nation. Well, my nation voted by 70 or 80 percentage points to jerk Enbridge's lease, basically say, nope, you're not allowed to build that pipeline here. For me personally, that pipeline runs, about 100 meters away from my family's burial site on the reservation. So tying it back into burials. So these are all examples of environmental degradation. Okay, so I promise I'm going to pull this back into talking about burials now. These are all examples of what we would call bad relationships to land. Well, what do I mean by that? The Métis scholar Max Liberon at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador, in their book Pollution is Colonialism, talked about relations to land. For those of you that are familiar with the book, and if you're not, I highly recommend reading it. It is a really, really good book. They're mainly talking about plastics pollution and talking about the ways in which people have historically, settler colonialism has tried to figure out how much pollution they can get away with inflicting upon the land. But really at its heart, it's actually a book about relationships to land, right? Where Max says, well, in indigenous cultures and indigenous communities, we have deep connections to land. We have relationships to lands. We have accountabilities to land. That it's not just something that we can act upon. It's not something that we can exploit or abuse, but it's something that deeply shapes who we are. I can speak for myself, right? Relationship to land is really, really super important to me. I could go on and on and on and wax all kinds of poetic about being back on my tribe's homeland, right, and the feeling that it can bring. But I also think about the accountabilities that I have to land where I'm at, right? I live off of Fanio Beach in Victoria, so I really lucked out. I have like an apartment right on the waterfront for under $2,000 a month. Like I'm not moving out of there like anytime soon. But I think about, well, I got to make sure that I'm being in good relation, right, and making sure that I'm respecting the environment. Because we are shaped by the land and we shape the land in turn, right? That the things that we do and that when we act upon the land, we shape it in various ways, and we can shape it in good ways, right? Or sometimes we can shape it in not very good ways, right? So you can be in good relation or you can be in bad relation with land. Okay. What does this all mean for ecocide and grave disturbances? Well, I say that modern-day grave disturbances and the exploitation of indigenous burial sites is ecocide, right? Because this comes out of the view of indigenous burial sites as politically lifeless spaces that can be exploited or disturbed in order to make room for settler economic and environmental development, right? Kind of this idea that like, oh, well, they're dead. Like, we can dig them up, we can bulldoze them, we can build over them, and it's not really, really a big deal, right? I'm working on a paper right now about kind of settler conceptions of burial sites in cemeteries, both settler cemeteries and indigenous cemeteries. And I have noticed in my work that there is a lack of care related to indigenous burial sites versus settler cemeteries. For example, I just finished last year, I did a fieldwork trip where I sat in university archives for a week and a half and took a look at burial records. And when it comes to like Judeo-Christian cemeteries, there is all kinds of books written about them, reports about their, about their state, letters about how we can preserve them. But then you take a look at a parallel history of disturbances of indigenous burial sites, and people are like, oh, we didn't know that they were there, right? Even though there's plenty of archival records about that as well, but there's kind of different importances that are attached to them. Particularly if indigenous burial sites are not well marked or well known, right? The idea is like, well, if we didn't know it was there, like, why are you getting mad at us for disturbing it? Like, obviously, our bad, like, So I'm going to give a couple examples here from my dissertation research and subsequent book that will be coming out later this year about some cases of disturbances of burial sites. And so my book and my dissertation focus very heavily on Minnesota. And so I took a look at kind of the settler invasions of burial sites in Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth is a major city at the western tip of Lake Superior, probably about 300 kilometers away from Thunder Bay, Ontario. And it happens to be a place where this kind of settler obsession with burial sites really comes to the fore, right? Where there's a lot of disturbances there. Ranging from the 1870s when that city first begun to develop, where there was a removal of indigenous burials at Wisconsin and Minnesota points, which are large sandbars at the tip of Lake Superior, and were deeply significant sites to Anishinaabe people. These sites were dug up in order to build lighthouses for navigation, as well as for building houses on top of them. For on the part of the early settlers, they did try to relocate them. They said, oh, well, we're going to put them in the cemetery over in neighboring Superior, Wisconsin, where we can put them. Well, they put them next to a riverbank, which subsequently eroded under rainfall, and indigenous burials and remains began to literally slide into the river, right? That they had to rebury them. And it actually wasn't until fairly recently that those bodies were actually finally repatriated back to their original resting places. The one case in particular that I'll kind of focus kind of a bit of my remaining time on here is repeated disturbances of historic indigenous burial sites in this Duluth neighborhood called Fond du Lac. Fond du Lac was an important site that dated all the way back to the original indigenous peoples that lived in what we now call Duluth, but it also was a site of interaction between French fur traders, British fur traders, American fur traders, and officials and indigenous peoples starting in the late 17th century all the way up into the early 20th century. Now, because there was a village here, because there was a fur trading post here, there were a couple of different cemeteries that were here. They were well documented, which becomes really interesting when we take a look at the fact that this burial site was disturbed 3 times within almost 70 years, right? In 1869, there was a railroad that was built through, part of the Northern Pacific Railway. So burials were disturbed there and relocated in 1870. Further railroad construction led to a disturbance in 1937. Road construction led to further disturbance, and plenty of newspaper articles about people finding indigenous remains. 80 years after 1937, well, it happened again. Now, as part of that road construction, they built a bridge over a small creek, and that bridge led to frequent backups of water in the creek and led to localized flooding in that neighborhood, right, where people would have their basements flooded out. Essentially, people by 2017, people were beginning to lobby the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to do something, because they're saying, well, we can't, our basements are getting flooded out, like, we're not, we had to get flood insurance, but now they're not even like going to give us flood insurance because they're like, well, this is going to continue happening. You got to do something about this. And so the Army Corps of Engineers said, well, we'll rebuild the bridge, right? We'll build it and we'll widen it so that water can flow back into the St. Louis River, which was a larger river nearby, and that it won't back up. And so they start to reconstruct the bridge and reconstruct the road. Well, they end up disturbing that burial site again for the 4th time. And they actually continued doing it for about, they did it, a local historian and her son found out about it and contacted a local tribe to get them to stop. The Army Corps of Engineers and the construction workers actually proceeded to keep going for 9 days before they finally stopped. The local tribal nation got involved, and there was kind of this back and forth about, well, what are we going to do about this? Because on one hand, we have to rebuild this bridge. We want to rebuild this road. People in the community are getting angry about this. On the other hand, the local tribe has said, you've disturbed this 4 times in like the last 130 years, right? You say that, well, we didn't know there's a burial site here, even though this is like one of the most widely documented burial sites in the upper Midwest. So now you're going to pay for this. It led to a lengthy repatriation and remediation process, which actually finally concluded last fall, where they finally reburied the bodies that were there, the remains, and built a memorial there. The Minnesota Department of Transportation, which was a major agency that was behind this, it was one of the most costly fuck-ups that they had ever encountered, right? Excuse my language, but that is the most accurate description, right? Cost them something like $30 million in order to pay back the tribe and to fix the damage that they caused. It's another obligatory map here. And so this was a fairly major area. This is about, I'd say, about 2 kilometers. And so you see kind of this road construction area here. This is a bridge that they were trying to rebuild, and this was kind of the construction and the repatriation area. So this is like a fairly major space that they had that was a burial site that they ended up disturbing because of this. All right, how am I doing on time? I'm doing all right. 5 to 10 minutes? Oh, good. All right. So now I want to tie this into another kind of term here, another kind of concept called indigenous cultural resource management. So I talked about that about 20 slides ago when I was talking about my research interest. what are indigenous cultural resources? So when we talk about that, a lot of times people think about, oh, well, you're talking about artifacts, you're talking about archives, you're talking about burials, you're talking about all these things that are tied into the past, right? But what if the environment itself is a cultural resource that can be protected? And more importantly, what happens if we can apply the lessons that we learn from protecting the dead, from protecting our historic cultural resources, and how can we apply that in a more holistic manner, right? Basically, what happens when the lessons that we take from protecting the dead can be applied to protecting the living? So, I found myself asking this question during my dissertation research. In particular, I was working with my own tribe, actually. I was working with what we call the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, which is an office that is tasked with overseeing cultural resources on the reservation. And I really got to know the Historic Preservation Officer, a really, really awesome person. She no longer works for the tribe, but we still talk almost every day and still, kind of work together on this kind of work. And she kind of told me about the work that her office does. She says, well, in particular, anytime somebody puts in a shovel on the Leech, puts a shovel in the ground on the Leech Lake Reservation, they have to come talk to us because we want to make sure that they're not accidentally disturbing any kind of remains or any kind of cemeteries. And so in particular, during one of my summers of field work, there was a road construction project that was going on the reservation. And given that what had happened in Duluth, I was like, oh, this could be potentially another example of like some disturbances going on. And so I was talking to her through this project over the course of a couple of summers, and one day she said, well, we finished our survey of this highway, and there's no cultural resource, or there's no burials there. And so we're allowing it to proceed. She says, well, we're still doing surveys. And I'm like, okay, well, if there's no burials, why are you still doing surveys? And she said, well, I'll show you, come on. And so we hopped into my rental Jeep, and we started driving along this road. And after a bit, she said, okay, pull over into this ditch. And we got out, and we started looking around. And she started pointing out all of these different plants. So she said, well, you take a look at this plant here and this plant here. These are important medicines for our people, and we need to make sure that they have access to them. And road construction doesn't just impact burials, it can also impact plants and animals and other things, right, that are important to the environment and important to our cultural vitality. Let me tell you that focusing on indigenous burials and death geographies, which is something that I've been doing for a long time, it's really heavy work, right? It's something where I tend to, people are like, you joke around a lot in like your lectures and like your research and things like that. I'm like, well, I have to, right? Because otherwise I'm going to be really bummed out talking about this kind of stuff, right? And I was kind of thinking like, I'd been, kind of a difficult field work season. I was like, maybe one day I won't have to write about death anymore. That moment there in the ditch, learning about all these different plants, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm not talking about death, am I? I'm talking about creating new possibilities for life and new possibilities for our cultural revitalization. And that was where everything changed, right? This is where my work began to focus on human-environment interactions and political ecology, and began to focus on not just thinking about, well, how do we protect the dead but also, what can the dead tell us about protecting the living and the more than human around us? And so I want to close here with kind of some future considerations about this, how we can kind of counteract kind of ecocide, from an indigenous cultural resource lens. The repositioning of indigenous cultural resource management towards becoming more holistic, right? Thinking about all elements of our cultures and environments together rather than bifurcations between the living and the dead. The recognition of the political agency of the indigenous dead. They can still inspire resistance and resurgence by the living. And really, through all of this, continuing to build robust protections for indigenous cultural sites from development and disturbance in the name of environmental well-being. And by doing this, I think we can create a better future, a more promising future for the next generations of our people. So with that, I want to say miigwech gigawabamin. Thank you. I'll talk to you again soon. Here's my contact information. I look forward to your questions and to being in conversation with you. And thanks for listening to me today.